as a federal offense.
You see this? This is a video game adaptation of a movie. Now, is it any good? Well, maybe? So have you ever watched a movie and been like, man, I want to immerse myself into this vast universe that this movie's made? Well, at least someone out there has, because I can now thankfully immerse myself into the world of Cars.
Watch it, Mr. Race Car! Watch it! And stay in your own lane!
This is stupid. Alright, so video game adaptations of movies were a massive trend in the early 2000s. Pretty much every movie whose demographic was children received some sort of video game adaptation. These games performed super well thanks to them already having a huge audience from fans of the movies. Publishers went crazy with these games, releasing a ton of them and milking them for every ounce of money that they could. Now, most of these games weren't very good for a ton of reasons. So, usually these games were released around the same year that the movie was released, sometimes even within like a week or two of each other. But, the developers didn't really know much about the actual movie when developing the game, causing these games to sometimes be quite different from the actual movie. The developers of the game would usually receive a write-up of the movie's plot, including character sheets and additional settings. Now, this isn't always the case, but more often than not, it was. A great example of a game that probably didn't receive these, or at least not much of them at least, would be the Shrek movie video game. In November of 2001, a few months after the Shrek movie had its release in theaters, the Shrek video game released for the Xbox, and it's definitely something. Something you'll quickly realize is just how goofy a lot of these adaptations were, whether if it's because it was rushed in development, if it was just a poor adaptation, or if it was all around just a mess of an experience. Now, this game, it's a victim of all of the above. You basically run around as Shrek, platforming and doing various missions for people, and it's just a complete mess. It doesn't really follow much of the original Shrek plot, it's just kind of like a Shrek game that happens in the Shrek universe, kind of like a spin-off, which isn't bad, but it makes the game a little less appealing to some. While for an Xbox game, this game actually does look really nice visually, thanks to it being one of the first commercial titles to ever use deferred shading technology, but its gameplay is just super sloppy and the story just doesn't quite do it. According to some random guy in a YouTube comment section, this game was very rushed and was made in less than a year. Yeah, I'd believe it. Though, for what it's worth, it is quite impressive for having it been made in less than a year. Though, I wouldn't be surprised if this was a common trend for a lot of movie games that released. Oddly enough though, this game ended up getting a reworked version released for the Gamecube in October of 2002, almost a full year later, and does it solve many of the game's issues? No, not really. Also, on an unrelated note, what is going on with the voiceovers for this game? Listen to this.
What are you doing here, Mama Spider? Will you please get off my grounds? I've got to go cleaning in the crypts. That's it. I give up.
That is not Shrek. That's most definitely not Shrek, but for some reason his voice quotes and gameplay are a completely different voice actor? What's going on? This game is a mess, but luckily there's another 50 Shrek games that have been released to make up for it. Yeah, you heard me right. There's over 50 Shrek video games that have been released. Let's talk about a few more. Shrek 2 also got a video game, and this time they actually followed the story of the original movie, albeit not perfectly, but they did a better job. Now, this game is also a platformer with weird puzzles and minigames, and its gameplay also features beat-em-up mechanics where you can just run and punch enemies, and what is wrong with Shrek? Hold on, why do they look like this? Okay, it was released on April of 2004, and man, this game is definitely something. It's definitely better than the first Shrek game, but there's still this weird unshakable vibe to this game. Each character you play as has their own abilities, like Fiona's iconic ability to slow down time. Oh, I remember that from the movie! This game has a lot of weird janky mechanics that just make it feel like a mess to play. Now, to this game's credit, it's not bad to play. In fact, I had some fun playing it for a while, but it's just unnerving having these guys staring at you for the entirety of the game. Now, this is a reminder that these games are targeted towards kids. They almost always are. As a kid, I definitely know for a fact I overlooked a bunch of these glaring issues with these games, but man, when you've played good movie games, it's hard to go back. What's an example of a good movie game? Well, it sure probably isn't Shrek 3, so we're gonna talk about Shrek 3, because I feel like talking about Shrek 3. Alright, I know I just said that Shrek 3 probably isn't a very good movie game, but I actually consider this to be one of the best Shrek games that ended up releasing. Published by Activision, Shrek 3 the video game was released on May of 2007 along with the movie. Like Shrek 2, this game is a beat-em-up platformer. I really enjoyed this game game as a kid, more so than any of the other Shrek games. The beat-em-up mechanics were surprisingly fun, and there were a ton of collectibles and was a more linear game, which I definitely appreciated. The platforming was fun, and just like the movie, the game presented itself as a stage play. You were able to play as multiple characters throughout the game, like Shrek, Puss in Boots, Donkey, Princess Fiona, Artie, and Sleeping Beauty. They each kind of have their own gameplay styles, and I really enjoyed playing as Puss in Boots in this game. In general, this game is a fun beat-em-up platformer game that I think had a lot of charm to it. The game's quite goofy, but in a Shrek way, you know? This game probably did the best at adapting a Shrek game and keeping the vibe that the movies had. Now, I don't like Shrek Forever After, so I'm not going to talk about the game adaptation for it because I am biased towards disliking it. That said, nah, it really still doesn't look much better. Thankfully though, there's 50 other Shrek games to talk about, like Shrek 2 Beg for Mercy looks interesting. It released on the Game Boy Advance in October of 2004 and is a spin-off story of Shrek 2 where the main character is Puss in Boots, and it's a pretty generic puzzle platformer beat-em-up game for the Game Boy Advance with enemies that you beat up. It's pretty uninteresting.
You're mistaken.
Where did you come from?
Yes.
Later.
Okay, so if I'm mistaken, what's the game really about?
So, this game is actually the first game to feature Puss in Boots as the main character. The first piece of media. So, like, even before the Puss in Boots movie, before The Last Wish, this was the first time Puss in Boots was our main hero. What's the game about? It's a side-scroller. So, you move from the left side of the level to the right side of the level. I think there's a story.
Okay, how in-depth is Shrek 2 Beg for Mercy?
It's a little more in-depth than I was expecting. When you play as Shrek or Donkey, you've got super limited moves. So, like, you can jump and you can punch. That's pretty much it. But Puss has, like, a moveset. The gameplay itself doesn't really go too in-depth. So once you've played one level, you've played them all.
Okay, so is it better than a lot of Game Boy Advance games of a similar style?
I mean, I had a surprising amount of fun with it, to be honest. I played my fair share of Game Boy Advance games when I was younger, and I really liked the tight movements. I never felt like I was cheated by the mechanics within the game. It was quite responsive, and the game flows really well.
So, for the record, who are you, and how do you know this much?
Well, you see, I am the current world record holder of Shrek 2 Beg for Mercy. Thank you. Thank you. Edit people clapping behind me. I put a green screen here. You have to do it.
It'll be done. It'll be done. I could not.
Just it. I grinded that game for so many hours. At one point, I was the one begging for mercy. But I did it. I got the record. And if anyone who moderates that game ever logs into speedrun.com, it'll be on the leaderboards.
What? Now, these video game adaptations have existed for a while, dating all the way back to Raiders of the Lost Ark, the first officially licensed movie game that was released for the Atari in 1982. There was even a Superman game that was released in 1979 on the Atari that was tied to the release of Superman the movie from 1978. Now listen, I haven't seen either of these movies, but I don't think these are good adaptations of the source material. Sorry Atari. There's also Death Race the video game from 1976, which was an arcade release that was also in modification of the 1975 arcade game Destruction Derby. Now, it's debated whether Death Race has any correlation to the 1975 film Death Race 2000, despite the developer claim that it was not the case. Now, the reason why I mention these titles is because it's debated which of these three might be the first real video game adaptation of a movie. Video game adaptations of movies continue to release, like the Jaws one on the NES, developed by Atlas. There's also the B-movie one that I've been told is literally Grand Theft Auto. I don't know how true this is because I've not played it and I don't feel like playing it, but you know, hey, I'll take his word for it. In May of 2005, the Madagascar movie was released. I think Madagascar is a good movie, but this is okay. Like, it's okay. It's a platformer game for the most part. There were some mini games like fishing. I played this one and it's definitely a Madagascar game. That said, it's a mess that doesn't really know what it wants to be. Some levels being linear, some being collectathons, some being mini games, and it just doesn't really come together very well. It's not bad by any means, but it really just showed me that there's some kind of blueprint that these games followed. Simply take the platforming elements, unlockable moves, and enemies that you press a B on to defeat, throw in a minigame or two, and there you have yourself the blueprint for a video game adaptation of a movie. Simply switch up the characters, change the setting a little bit, and there you go. That said, even with this format, some of these games aren't awful. Some of these are actually quite a special experience. Specifically, the game I'm talking about is the Spongebob Movie Game. Now, this is a video game adaptation of a movie done well. The Spongebob Squarepants Movie Game was developed by Heavy Iron Studios and published by THQ. It was released in October of 2004 and is an amazing game. Despite being a platformer with many games and different gameplay styles on top of being a collectathon, it's probably one of the best video game adaptations of all time. This game made childhoods for many people, including myself. It ran on the same engine as Battle for Bikini Bottom, one of the best SpongeBob games in the entire series, and as a movie adaptation on the same engine, it was super well done. SpongeBob and Patrick were both playable, and you would go through the game collecting Goofy Goober tokens to progress through the game. Over time, you can unlock and level up new abilities to make further progress and power yourself up so you can complete new challenges and levels easier. The bosses in the game are super fun, and I love the bonus platforming challenges in the game. Admittedly, the late game of this game is a little rough, but it's not that bad really. I had a blast playing through the game. That said, I don't like driving the paddy wagon. I am bad at it. The story very closely followed the movie and had some unforgettable level design, and thanks to that and the amazing gameplay from Battle for Bikini Bottom, it allowed this game to be one of the best movie game adaptations that I've ever played. Now, I think I'm about to say something quite controversial, but when talking about adaptations of movies into video games, one company that has always made great games would be Lego. Now, would I consider these to be adaptations of the movies? Yeah, kind of. I feel like these games are more like spin-offs of the same plot, if that makes sense. They're extremely good and generally follow the plot of the movies, but somehow, at least to me, these Lego games have always stuck out from the rest of the competition. I say this because of that weird status quo that all video game adaptations of movies usually aren't that good, but these Lego games, on the other hand, are something special. Is it good because it's Lego, or is it Lego because it's good? I don't really know. I played the Lego Star Wars games on my PS2 and had a ton of fun playing through them. Maybe it's that I usually associate these movie games with weird scuffed titles that work well, but are just really strange or weird in one way or another. And since Lego titles are just super good, they don't fall into this. An example of a pretty weird video game adaptation of a movie would be the Cars video games, specifically Cars 1.
Lightning! Ow!
¿Cómo estás, amigo?
Cars 1, the video game, released on June 6th of 2006, 3 days before the Cars movie was released. This information ended up spurring those Lightning McQueen and Super Smash Bros. Ultimate memes when the Fighter Pass was still going on after people discovered this. Anyway, this was an open-world Cars game where you can drive around Radiator Springs and do races as the different cars in the game. You had objectives to complete to progress the story, and man, does this game not play very well. But, you know, it definitely does play. There's a bunch of missions in the game, races, playable characters, modes, and honestly, it isn't a bad adaptation of what a Cars game could be. I would argue that it's not a bad adaptation at all, honestly. For a racing game from 2006, you gotta look at the competition. It's really not horrible, it's just uninteresting and have a lot of environments that just feel super empty. If you're a young Cars fan, I could see you having a blast with this game. Now, tons of movies continue to receive these video game adaptations, but unfortunately, this trend didn't last for much longer where each movie would end up getting its own game. Like, don't get me wrong, it kept happening, but it slowed down significantly because games began costing more to make, and with the next generation, PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 coming in, that meant that the competition rose. With rising competition, that means you just can't keep cranking out the same rinse and repeat blueprint slop and expect to be able to buy it, especially at full price. I feel like younger audiences started to gather a greater interest in other games that were free or cheaper as time went on, like Roblox, Minecraft, or they would just start to grow up and acquire different tastes for what they wanted. It doesn't help that at this point, a lot of movies that already received adaptations ended up getting sequels, and the games would too, and it would just be much more minimal effort until it just wasn't worth it. Nowadays, video game adaptations of movies are pretty uncommon, especially as direct tie-ins. It's usually more stuff around the lines of in the universe of, or a spin-off. Now, that doesn't mean that these are bad, but it's clear that times have changed for both movies and video games, and with the younger audience being an older audience now, you just can't keep selling the same stuff to that same audience and not expect it to fall off. Another series that could be considered a movie adaptation collection of sorts would be the Kingdom Hearts series, but I would kind of group this in with the Lego games where it's not quite the same. In fact, Kingdom Hearts especially is much more of its own thing with whatever goes on in this universe. I still don't really know why I treat Lego games as if they're not movie adaptations, but it really probably is just that they're that good that lumping them in with all of this just doesn't seem right to me at all. It's not that these movie games are bad, but you can tell that a lot of these games are rushed and just weren't the best. That said, there's a whole lot of fun to be had with these games, but I think it's for these same reasons why spin-offs of franchises do better as games as opposed to adapting a movie. For example, SpongeBob Battle for Bikini Bottom is probably one of the best games in the SpongeBob franchise. I would even argue that it's one of the best platformers of all time, but it's not exactly based off of a SpongeBob episode or movie. I think spin-offs are by far one of the better directions to go with movie or film inspired media these days. As a huge trend, especially in the early 2000s, it was a little sad to see this trend die off, but it really goes to summarize an era in not only the video game industry, but also in the movie industry. Tons of video game adaptations of movies exist out there, especially if it's a movie directed towards the younger audience. Some were fully unique and original experiences, some were platformers with weird mini-games and puzzles, and some were Crash Bandicoot ripoffs. Yeah, that's right, I'm talking about you, Lilo and Stitch. Weren't even a good Crash Bandicoot ripoff. Ugh. Thanks for watching the video. Be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed. Check out my other content as well, and check out Zimtful, who gave me this idea for this video and helped collaborate with me for some stuff. I got the opportunity to speak a little bit in his video as well, so please be sure to check that out. Please leave a comment talking about some of your favorite experiences with these movie games. There's a ton of them, and I only talked about a few, so I'd love to hear more about the ones that I missed.